Look, most people who get a heart transplant feel like they've experienced a miracle the moment they leave the operating room. It's as if they've been reborn. They thank God from the bottom of their hearts for that new heart beating in their chest, giving them a second chance at life. But for me, everything was different. I loathe this heart that beats inside me. These thumps feel like the rhythmic beat of a funeral drum. This heart didn't just fail to save me. It slowly stripped away everything I owned and dragged my life into the blackest soot. If you want to know how a life-giving gift can turn into the greatest curse in history, you need to hear my story. The story of Daniel, a man who lost, and in the worst way possible. It all started when I was 30. Back then, I thought I was the luckiest man on earth. I had a respectable job, lived with my mother in a small, cozy house, and most importantly, I had Mary. Mary was 29, and my entire world was captured within her brown eyes. We would have died for each other, and we were preparing ourselves for a life together. But you know, fate doesn't always follow the plans we draw. Everything began at my company, or more accurately, in Linda's management office. Linda was my boss, an incredibly wealthy, arrogant, and influential woman who was used to giving orders to everyone. One day, she messaged me and said I should meet her at a quiet cafe. She said it was a very important matter. Knowing nothing of what was to come, I agreed. When I arrived at the meeting, Linda sat across from me, very elegant and poised, and without any preamble, she dropped the bomb. She looked me in the eye and said she was interested in me and wanted to marry me. Can you believe it? She said if we were compatible, she could take me to the top. At that moment, it felt like time stopped for me. I knew that if I said yes, all my financial miseries would end. I would no longer have to worry about installments, debts, or rent. I could transform from a simple clerk into someone others tipped their hats to. Linda's wealth was tempting, very tempting. But at that same moment, Mary's face appeared before my eyes. I remembered the days we had made our promises to each other. I couldn't turn my back on Mary. I couldn't trade her pure love for Linda's money. So, very firmly, though with stress, I told her, "Thank you for your trust, but I am in love with Mary and I want to marry her." Linda said nothing. She just gave a bitter smile and left, but it was clear from her eyes that this story wouldn't end there. The next day, while I was busy working in my room, the door swung open and Linda walked in. There was no trace of that mild tone from the cafe. With a particular audacity, she stared at me and said, "Daniel, either you marry me, or you get fired from this company right now." I was shocked. I knew that if I were fired, finding another job with this salary in this market would be nearly impossible. Linda was using her power and money to put me in a vice. She told me that if I left, I might never reach such a position again. But can a person force their heart to belong to someone else? Again, because of Mary, I looked into her eyes and said no. Linda, without hesitation, signed my termination papers. When I told Mary, the poor girl got very worried. Right then, with a lump in her throat, she told me, "Let's get married right now. Whatever happens, happens." But I didn't want to make Mary a partner in poverty and misery. I took her hands and promised her that I would first find a good job, and then we would move in together. From the next day, I put on my iron shoes. From one end of the city to the other, I filled out forms in every company you can imagine. For 2 whole weeks, from morning to night, my life was spent running after a loaf of bread. But it seemed every door was closed to me. No one wanted me. 2 weeks passed, and I grew more hopeless every day, unaware that fate was preparing a much filthier game for me, a game that would end in a hospital and a stranger's heart. This was only the beginning of my misfortune. I remember we were sitting on one of those damp wooden park benches. The sun was pale, and I was talking to Mary about the plans I had drawn for our future. Mary, as always, was staring at me with that kind gaze, trying to give me hope that I would eventually find a job. But the peace of that moment shattered like glass into 1,000 pieces with the vibration of Mary's phone. The name, Dad, appeared on the screen. Mary answered, and I only saw the color drain from her face. Joseph, Mary's 50-year-old father, informed her over the phone with a voice trembling with fear that Mary's brother, that hard-working boy who worked in the factory, had been wounded with a knife. Mary couldn't even say goodbye to me. She hurriedly took a taxi and flew toward the hospital with tearful eyes. When Mary arrived, she saw Joseph, who looked 10 years older, huddled outside the operating room. Mary sat beside him, and Joseph told her through sobs what had happened. He said factory workers told the police that her brother had argued with one of his colleagues named James, and James, godforsaken, had attacked him with a knife. The fugitive James had now become that family's nightmare. The surgery lasted for hours, but it was useless. The wounds were deep, and the bleeding wouldn't stop. Mary's brother said goodbye to this world under the surgical blade. The police were still looking for James when we buried that young man's lifeless body. At the funeral, Mary had no strength left, but a greater grief was on the way that was going to break both of our backs. To tell you the truth, I had been feeling a vague pain in my chest for some time. I thought it was due to the psychological pressure of being fired and the stress of finding work. One day, exactly when I was filling out an application at a company and hoping this time it would finally work, it felt as if a multi-ton weight was placed on my chest. I couldn't catch my breath. Everything went black, and I fell face first to the ground. When I opened my eyes, I saw the white ceiling of an ambulance and heard the siren echoing in my head. News had reached my mother, and that poor woman had rushed to the hospital with trembling legs. I was struggling between life and death in the emergency room, and Mary, poor Mary, who knew nothing, was calling my phone repeatedly. But who was there to answer? I didn't even have the strength to move my hand. Night fell, and the lack of news drove Mary to the brink of madness. She couldn't take it anymore and went to my mother's house. When she saw the lights were out and no one was answering the door, her heart sank. My mother's neighbor, seeing Mary's distraught state, came forward and said compassionately, "My girl, Daniel has had a heart attack. They took him to the hospital. His mother is there too." Hearing this, it felt as if the world had collapsed on Mary's head. In that same broken state, she reached my bedside. I was lying on the bed, under a mass of wires and tubes, and I couldn't even tell her, "Don't worry." My mother, with tearful eyes, told Mary that the doctors had laid it out plainly. They said Daniel's heart couldn't take it anymore. He had to have a transplant as soon as possible, or it would be over. Mary, whose grief for her brother was still fresh, was now losing me too. During those nights, Mary's only work was crying and pleading with God. She screamed from the bottom of her soul, wanting me to stay alive. But none of us knew that Mary's prayer was going to be answered in the strangest and most terrifying way possible. No one thought my life was going to be tied to the blood of Mary's brother. Look, justice is sometimes served in a way that makes you wonder whether to laugh or wail at your own state. In those same days when I was on the hospital bed feeling like a dagger was thrust into my chest with every breath, across town, the police had finally tracked down James. James, the man who had taken down Mary's brother, was hiding in an old, dilapidated house. When the officers raided to arrest him, James, like a trapped animal, jumped out the window and bolted. The sound of police sirens, the vibration of the ground under James's feet, and the terror in his eyes. Everything was condensed into a single moment. As he was trying with all his might to cross the street to vanish, the sound of tires screeching on asphalt rose, and then, a massive thud. James was thrown violently onto the windshield of a car and then crumpled to the ground. The police brought his semi-conscious body to the same hospital where I was hospitalized. His head was badly injured. James became brain dead. Do you see fate? Exactly when I was experiencing the last beats of my weak heart, the heart of James, The man who had blackened the life of Mary's family was still beating healthy and strong. The doctors, without us knowing anything, without Mary or her father Joseph realizing whose chest this heart came from, transplanted it into me. Now, inside my body, the heart of my love's brother's killer was beating. I survived, was discharged, and returned home, but with an uninvited guest in my chest that, if it had a tongue, would reveal the bitterest truths in the world to me. When the recovery period ended, the same running around started again. I didn't want Mary to think I wasn't the same person. After several weeks of filling out forms and going to interviews, I finally got hired at a new company. Everything seemed to be going well until a stranger appeared. One day, as I was leaving my mother's house, a woman about 30 years old, with eyes hollowed out from crying, blocked my way. Her voice trembled. She said she was James's sister. She said she had found my address through an acquaintance at the hospital. That woman, with a strange plea in her eyes, told me, "Daniel, I know it's strange. I know you might be afraid, but that brother was my whole life. Now that his heart is in your chest, it's like a piece of him is still alive. I just want to hear the sound of its beats for a few seconds. Let me find peace." To be honest, I felt sorry for her. I felt she, like us, was a victim of this filthy game. I agreed. That woman came forward, trembling, and placed her head on my chest, right where James's heart was pounding. She closed her eyes and her sobs rose. At that exact cursed moment, a taxi braked at the corner. It was Mary. She had come to surprise me, but she was the one who got a terrible surprise. From behind the taxi window, Mary saw me standing there calmly while a strange woman had her head on my chest. What did Mary think? Obviously, she thought all those loyalties were lies. She thought I had betrayed her. That scene was the final blow for her. Without getting out, she told the driver to turn back with eyes full of tears. Mary had wailed all the way home. When she arrived, Joseph saw that his daughter was dying of grief. He asked what happened, but Mary didn't want to tell the truth. She was afraid her father would cause a bloodbath. She lied and said she remembered her brother. Mary was struggling with herself. A part of her said Daniel wouldn't do this, but that scene, that image of that woman's head on my chest, wouldn't leave her. For 2 whole weeks, Mary watched me like a ghost. She wanted to be sure. And my bad luck was that James's sister came to see me again. Exactly when I was off work, she came again to be calmed by the sound of that cursed heart. She put her head on my chest again, and Mary, who was hiding behind the trees in that corner, saw everything. This time, she had no doubt. For Mary, the loving Daniel was dead and a traitor had taken his place. When James's sister got into a taxi to leave, Mary followed her with endless rage. She wanted to know who this woman was who had taken her place. As soon as James's sister got out at her house, Mary reached her like a storm. She started screaming, insulting, and trembling. "Get out of Daniel's life. You shameless woman. How could you?" Mary was exploding. James's sister was shocked. She kept trying to explain. "Ma'am, you're mistaken. I only wanted to hear my brother's heart beat." But the maddened Mary, the heartbroken Mary, wouldn't believe anything. For Mary, our beautiful world had been dragged through the mud, and she didn't know that this woman was the sister of the person who had left the grief of her brother in their hearts. Mary felt stabbed from both sides, both by her love and by a stranger. That morning, the sun hadn't quite risen properly when the storm began. I was sitting at my desk in my room trying to concentrate, but suddenly the door opened with such force that it hit the wall, and a loud sound echoed in the hallway. It was Mary, but not the kind Mary the first knew. Her eyes were bulging, blood red, and her hands were shaking. Before I could say a word, she rushed toward me. Her voice echoed in the room so much that it felt like the walls were shaking. She screamed, "Traitor! Scumbag! You were flirting with that girl right before my eyes. You thought I was blind? You thought I wouldn't see who you were hugging." Believe me, for a moment, It felt like time stopped in the company. The sound of typing stopped, the phones went silent, and a deadly hush took over the entire floor. All the employees, from the tea server to the vice president, gathered behind my office door. I could hear their whispers, but they didn't dare come in. Mary had become hysterical. She threw whatever was at hand. I just held my hands in front of my face and said pleadingly, "Mary, I swear on my mother's life it's a misunderstanding. It's not what you think. That girl, just..." But Mary wouldn't let me finish. She shrieked, "Shut up, Daniel. Don't lie anymore. I saw her. I saw where her head was." The noise escalated so much that the company manager walked in with a flushed face. He sternly sent the employees back to work and tried to calm Mary, but Mary wasn't Mary anymore. She was a gunpowder bomb whose pin had been pulled. Without listening to anyone, she grabbed her bag and ran out of the company with sobs that would roast a person's heart. Mary went home and locked herself in her room. Her sobs were such that Joseph, her dad, couldn't take it anymore. Joseph was a man who had seen the heat and cold of the world. He understood this crying wasn't for the grief of a brother. This crying was for a major fracture in his daughter's heart. He went behind the door and insisted so much until Mary, with puffy eyes, opened the door and laid everything out. She said Daniel had betrayed her, said she saw a strange girl with her head on Daniel's chest. Joseph, whose blood was boiling, got the girl's address from Mary. He wanted to settle the matter in his own way, like a man. He wanted to go and make that girl realize she shouldn't ruin a young man's life. Joseph went to James's sister's house. At first, he wanted to start a shouting match, but James's sister, who was scared and worried about her reputation among the neighbors, pleaded with him to come in so they could talk. Joseph entered reluctantly. Right upon entering, his gaze locked onto a picture frame with a black ribbon in the corner of the room, on the wall. Suddenly, it felt like time stopped for him. His eyes widened, his body went cold, and he felt his heart was stopping. That face, those eyes in the photo, that was James, his son's killer. James's sister, seeing Joseph frozen like a statue and pale, called his name several times. "Sir? Are you okay? Did something happen?" But Joseph was in another world. The nightmare of his life was right in front of him. Finally, when he came to, James's sister told him the bitter truth with tearful eyes. She said, "Sir, I know who you are. I am James's sister, the one whose heart is now beating in Daniel's chest. I just missed my brother. I wanted to hear the sound of his heartbeats from that boy's chest for one last time. Daniel is not to blame. He just felt sorry for me." With every word from that woman, it felt like Joseph was being stabbed in the liver. The truth was filthier than he thought. Joseph returned home with a shattered state and weak legs. Mary was waiting to hear that her father had punished that girl, but Joseph, with a shout that shook the whole house, said, "Mary, erase that ungrateful boy's name from your life right now. You don't even have the right to see Daniel's face anymore." Mary was shocked. "Dad, what are you saying? Didn't you say you were going to fix it?" Joseph, with a lump in his throat that blocked his airway, said, "Do you know whose heart is in Daniel's chest? Do you know who that girl was? Mary, in Daniel's chest, the heart of your brother's killer is beating. James's heart. That girl was James's sister who came to hear the heart of her criminal brother." It was as if a bucket of ice water was poured over Mary's head. The world spun around her. She felt like vomiting. The heart of the person who had torn her brother to pieces was now beating for her, or maybe for his own sister. Joseph ruthlessly threatened her. "If I find out you talked to him secretly, if I find out you went to see him, it's over between us. I won't let my daughter put her hand on a chest that holds my son's killer's heart." Mary was left with a world of dead ends and a heart that she no longer knew whether to pray for or wish for its stopping. It was night, and a light rain was falling. Mary, while wearing a scarf and hat and looking behind her trembling to make sure she didn't see her father's shadow following her, reached me. When we saw each other in that dark alleyway, her face was as white as chalk. Her lips were trembling. She took my hands. Her hands were ice cold. Without any preamble, with a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well, she said, "Daniel, that heart in your chest, it belongs to James. It belongs to the one who killed my brother." Believe me, it felt like the ceiling of the sky suddenly collapsed on me. The world spun around my head. I felt like an alien creature, a monster, was beating inside my chest. My hand instinctively went to my heart. The same heart that until a few moments ago I thought was my savior had now become my tormentor. I stammered. "What are you saying, Mary? It's impossible. This is a sick joke, right?" But Mary's incessant crying slammed the truth into my face. Mary, through her sobs, said that her father had found out everything. He found out that his son's killer was now living inside my body with his heart. She said Joseph swore that if he got his hands on me, he'd tear me to pieces. She said her father said, "I'd rather bury my daughter than let her become the wife of a man who has rented my son's killer's heart in his chest." That night, in that darkness, we two became the loneliest people on earth. Mary pleaded that her father must not find out she came to see me. I, however, despite the horror I felt for my heart, hugged Mary tightly. I could hear the pounding of that cursed heart in my ears. It was as if James was laughing at me from in there. I told Mary, "I can't, Mary. I can't breathe without you. To hell with this heart, to hell with the world. I won't let anyone take you from me." Mary also put her head on that same chest and said, "Daniel, I can't stand to see any woman other than me by your side either. We will stay by each other's side, even if the whole world stands against us." But Joseph was no longer the same man. The grudge and the grief for his son on one side, and the sense of betrayal he had from Mary on the other, had driven him to the brink of madness. He had become suspicious of Mary. One day, when we thought everything was safe and we were sitting in a cozy cafe, away from everyone's eyes, planning our escape, the cafe doors suddenly burst open. Joseph jumped in like a wounded tiger. His face was bruised with rage. The poor customers, seeing the volume of hate in Joseph's eyes, ran out in fear without paying their bills. The cafe emptied. Joseph came toward me, grabbed my shirt collar, and slammed me against the wall with such force that I felt my vertebrae shift. He pressed his face against mine and growled with a voice that sounded like it came from hell. "One more time. Just one more time hang around my daughter, and I swear I'll pull that stolen heart out of your chest so fast you won't know what hit you." Then he grabbed Mary, who was pleading through tears, and dragged her out of the cafe like a piece of meat. I was left with a world of humiliation and a heart that now beat with fear. The following days were house arrest for Mary. Every day and every hour, her work was pleading with Joseph. Mary would say, "Dad, what is Daniel's fault? He didn't know whose heart this was. He just wanted to stay alive to be with me." Mary even spoke of my sacrifices to soften Joseph's heart. She said Daniel rejected Linda and her legendary wealth for me. She said Daniel was willing to be fired, to be penniless, to be a vagabond, but not to turn his back on me. But Joseph's ears wouldn't listen to these words. To him, I was just a vessel that was moving the killer's memento of his son. I also went to his house twice. I wanted to kiss his hand. I wanted to say, "I am the same Daniel. Only my heart has changed, not my soul." But Joseph didn't even open the door. He shouted from behind the door that if I set foot on his stairs, my blood would be on my own hands. It was a dead end, a bloody dead end from which there was no escape. We had fallen into a well whose bottom was not visible, and the more we struggled, the more we drowned. The world has strange games. Just when you think you've reached the end of the line and there's no way out, fate opens a new door, but a door that is not clear whether it leads to heaven or to hell itself. Joseph, The same man who until yesterday considered my blood lawful to spill had now fallen into a corner of prison because of a heavy and back-breaking debt. The high walls and cold bars were slowly melting that iron pride of his. I had heard that in the prison yard, under the lifeless sun, he would walk for hours thinking of a way out. And do you know what happened? That man who said he didn't want to see my face now remembered Mary's words. He remembered that I, for the sake of his daughter's love, had rejected Linda and her legendary wealth. Joseph realized that the only key to his freedom was in my hands, or better said, in that wealth that I had once turned my back on. One day when I was drowned in work and trying to cope with my physical and spiritual pains, one of Joseph's close friends entered my room out of the blue. His face showed that he was the bearer of important news. When I asked what happened, he said in a tone as if he was brokering a dirty deal, "Daniel, Joseph has sent a message for you. He says if you want to marry Mary, there's only one way. You must clear all his debts so he can be released from prison. If you do this, he will no longer oppose your marriage." I froze. I told him, "Me? I'm a simple clerk. Where would I get all that money? If I had it, I wouldn't withhold it." But that man said with a smirk, "The money is not with you. It's with Linda. Go to her, tell her you're sorry, get money from her on the pretext of marriage, and free Joseph. This is the only way you can reach Mary." Believe me, what a war broke out inside of me. I was not a person for exploitation, especially of a woman's feelings. But on the other hand, the thought of losing Mary, the thought of seeing her next to someone else, was killing me. Distance from Mary was a poison that was slowly stopping my transplanted heart. Finally, with a heavy lump in my throat and against my inner will, I made my decision. To reach Mary, I had to drag myself through the mud. I went to my former company. Behind the door of Linda's office, I couldn't catch my breath. When I entered, Linda was so taken aback by seeing me it was as if she had seen a ghost. She stood up and stared into my eyes with disbelief. I began playing that filthy role. I lied to her and said, "Linda, Mary cheated on me. She bypassed me, and now I realize how much I was wrong. I only now appreciate you. Forgive me for talking to you that way that day." Linda, who seemed to be waiting for this one sentence, her eyes sparkled with joy. She still wanted me. Right there, we made the arrangements for marriage. Linda was so excited it was as if she had been given the whole world. From that day on, her work became buying expensive gifts for me. Every day a shopping mall, every day a brand name watch, $1,000,000 clothes, handmade shoes. I had become a display window for her wealth, but in my heart, I was exploding with shame and a guilty conscience. But Mary, poor Mary, who knew nothing of anything, had become suspicious of my absences and the change in my behavior. She thought I was truly betraying her. One day when Linda had taken me to a very luxury shopping mall to buy me gifts again, right in the middle of all that glitz and glamour, Mary appeared before me like an angel of torment. The world spun around my head. Linda was holding my hand and laughing while choosing a shirt for me when Mary arrived. Mary looked at me as if the soul had left her body at that very moment. I couldn't even say a word. I was tongue-tied. Mary came forward and, with all her might, slapped me across the face. The sound of that slap echoed through the shopping mall space as if a bomb had exploded. Linda jumped in angrily and shouted, "Get your hands off him, you low-life girl. Daniel is mine now. We are getting married. Don't let me see your face around my husband again." I just watched. I couldn't tell Mary, "My dear, I'm doing this to get your jerk of a father out of prison so he lets us be together." I didn't want Joseph to be ruined in front of his daughter. I didn't want Mary to know what kind of deal her father had made over her. Mary, with wet eyes, with a look that held 1,000 words and curses, looked at me for the last time and said, "Be happy, Daniel. I didn't think that when your heart changed, your nature changed too." Then she turned and left forever. At that moment, I felt that transplanted heart stop in my chest. I lost Mary so that I could gain her, and this was the bitterest paradox of my life. I was left with Linda, who was smiling at me in victory, in a world that no longer had any color. Linda, to give the final blow to my heart, and, in her own mind, to secure her place in my life, placed the keys to a top-of-the-line and incredibly expensive car in my hand one morning. She looked into my eyes and said with that triumphant smile, "This is for the man who is going to be my partner for the rest of my life." I looked at those keys and there was turmoil in my heart. Those keys were the warrant for Joseph's freedom for me, not a luxury car. As soon as I left the company, without delay, I went to a car dealer and sold that car for cash below market price. I poured all that money, every last cent, into the judiciary's account so Joseph's heavy debt would be cleared. I wanted this filthy game to end sooner. Joseph was released from prison, but I wish he had stayed there and I had never tainted my hands with that money. When that man stepped out of prison, instead of coming and thanking me, he went home and spun a false scenario for Mary. He told Mary that his wealthy employer's heart had softened and he paid the entire debt, and now Joseph was going to pay a portion of his salary every month as an installment. Mary, who had no soul's inkling of my sacrifice, believed her father's words. I went to see Joseph that same night. I told him, "I fulfilled my promise. I brought you out of that dungeon. Now it's your turn. Let me and Mary be together." But Joseph, with an impudence that burnt me to the bone, smirked and said, "I will never let you marry my daughter. You chose to give that money yourself. I didn't force you." That's when I realized Joseph had used my pure love for Mary only as a stepping stone for his own freedom and had thrown me away like a rag. Rage took over my entire being. I felt I had nothing left to lose. I decided to end this game right here. First of all, I went to Linda. With all the pain and suffering it caused, I told her the truth. I said I never loved her and was only with her for the money from that car and Joseph's freedom. Linda broke in a way that I heard the sound of her shattering. She only then realized how she had been used as a tool in a financial plot. After that, I went after Mary. I called her many times, sent 100 messages, but Mary didn't even want to hear my name. She thought I was a money-hungry person who sold his love for a watch and a car. One evening, when Mary was returning home tired and fed up from work, I blocked her path. Mary didn't even look at me. She passed by me with a terrible indifference. I ran after her and pleaded, "Mary, just 2 minutes. Just listen to what I say, then do whatever you want." Mary kept walking, and I was shouting behind her. Finally, when I saw she was reaching the front door of the house, I shouted, "Mary, your dad forced me. He sent a message from prison that if I didn't pay his debt, he wouldn't let us be together. I went to Linda for the sake of his freedom." Mary suddenly froze. It was as if time stopped. She slowly turned toward me. Her eyes were bulging out of her head with shock and disbelief. She stared at me and said with a trembling voice, "What did you say?" I, in that same broken state, revealed the whole truth to her. I said how her father had deceived me, how he asked me to get money from Linda, and how he went back on everything after his release. Mary was so shocked it was as if the world had collapsed on her. Without saying a word, she turned with a manic rage and jumped into the house. The sounds of Mary's screams, shouting at her dad and calling him out for this baseness and cowardice, could be heard out in the street. That night, the curtains were pulled back, but at what price? I had brought Mary back, but with a soul that was no longer healthy in any part. The next day, when Mary woke up with a transformed state and a pale face, neither of us knew that fate was revealing its final cards to us. Mary had been feeling sick for a few days, and we thought it was due to those same heavy stresses and the fights with Joseph. But when she went to the lab and got that cursed paper, everything changed. Mary was 1 month pregnant, and unintentionally so, right in the middle of this purgatory we were stuck in. Mary, in that same trembling state, came straight from the lab to my company. When she called me and put the paper in my hand, I froze at first. I was shocked, but in the bottom of my heart, a light suddenly turned on. A strange joy ran through my veins. I thought this child could fix everything. I thought this new blood could wash away all the grudges. I looked at Mary and laughed with all my being. I was happy that the fruit of our love was now taking shape inside Mary. But this joy was a national disaster for Joseph. When Mary told him the story at home, Joseph started shouting as if he had seen a demon. The walls of that house shook from the sound of Joseph's shouting. With total impudence, he stared into his daughter's eyes and said, "You must abort this child tomorrow. I won't let a cub come into this world from that man who has my son's killer's heart in his chest. You want to let that criminal's blood flow in my grandchild's veins." Mary, however, for the first time in her life, stood before her father like a mountain. She put her hand on her stomach and said firmly, "This child is my love. This child is my world. I will never destroy it, and I will marry Daniel, the father of my child." Joseph, seeing that Mary was no longer the same obedient girl of the past, out of the extreme manic rage that had seized him, threw Mary out of the house in that same condition and shouted, "Don't even mention your name again. You are dead to me." Mary called me with tearful eyes. That night, I took Mary to a cozy hotel so she could stay there temporarily. A few days later, in a bitter exile and loneliness, we got married. We rented a small house and started our life together. We thought Joseph's hand could no longer reach us, but that man's grudge was deeper than that. One day when I was at the company, Joseph found our new address and went to see Mary. Mary, who was afraid of even her father's shadow, didn't open the door. Joseph started threatening and shouting behind the door in the building's hallway. He was saying, "You must abort it. I won't let that child be born." Mary was shouting from behind the door, "Dad, go away. Leave us alone." The argument escalated and Mary finally opened the door to calm her father down. But Joseph had completely lost control. In that narrow hallway, Joseph, with a rage that smelled of blood, pushed Mary hard. He wanted Mary to fall so that maybe the child would be aborted. But Mary lost her balance and fell from the top of the hallway's stone stairs with a terrible intensity. The sound of Mary's head hitting the stone stairs still rings in my ears. Blood took over everywhere. Joseph, thinking Mary had only fainted, ran down with trembling hands and took Mary's head in his arms. He was shouting, "Mary, get up. Dad was wrong." But no sound came. Joseph put his head on Mary's chest, but not a single beat. Mary's pulse had stopped. My Mary, along with that innocent babe in her womb, had finished. Neighbors poured into the hallway. The police came, the ambulance came, but it was already too late. I arrived when the body of the love of my life was under a white sheet. The world went black for me. I looked into Joseph's eyes, the man who sacrificed his daughter and grandchild for the revenge of his son. I sued Joseph. That man who wanted to ruin our lives with his release from prison went back to those same cold bars, but this time for the crime of murdering his own flesh and blood. Now I am left with an empty house and a transplanted heart that beats in my chest. A heart whose every beat is a reminder of the blood that killed Mary's brother and now itself has witnessed Mary's death. I am alive, but I wish that on that day in the operating room, this heart had never beaten.
All the stories I share on my channel are written by me, and unlike other YouTube channels, they are not copied. So I would appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to my channel to motivate me to write new stories.